The clear, melodious sound of Tao's singing echoed softly in the early morning air, blending with the gentle rustling of leaves in the roadside market. Each footstep that passed by seemed to carry its own untold story, the whispers of lives lived, of dreams pursued. At a humble corner of the market, Mrs. Tam's small stall stood, hidden under the protective shade of a Kujia lemongrass tree. It was a modest setup, a simple basket of bananas, a few ripe bunches, an old worn-out scale, and a plastic sheet spread out on the ground to serve as a seat. Mrs. Tam, now nearly 80 years old, had a face that showed the traces of time, wrinkled and tired, but her eyes remained bright with a warmth that spoke of a life lived with purpose. Her expression was kind, and as she sat curled up in a faded plastic chair, her old, torn, conical hat shielded her from the sun's occasional rays that peeked through the leaves above. Despite her age and the hardships life had dealt her, she had grown accustomed to the hustle and bustle of the market. Every morning, long before the sun fully rose, Mrs. Tam would wake up to prepare for the day ahead. She would gather the bunches of bananas she had bought the previous day and bring them to the market, hoping for a little extra money to support herself. On sunny days, her bananas would sell quickly, but on rainy, chilly days, she would sit alone, waiting for customers, until well into the afternoon with her bananas unsold. By the time she returned to her small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, she was often exhausted. There, she would lie on her back, gazing at the old bed covers, her mind wandering back to the days of her youth when life was filled with laughter and love. Her husband had passed away early, but it had not been a time of sorrow. She had her daughter, little Mai, who brought her joy. Mai was the light of her life, her reason for hope, her motivation, but life had not turned out the way Mrs. Tam had dreamed. When Mai came of age, a bitter dispute with her husband's family forced them to leave their hometown. They moved to the city, a life of exile and uncertainty. Little Mai, with her big round eyes and shiny black hair, was the only bright spot in Mrs. Tam's life. Yet, fate would soon play a cruel trick on her. One day, as they wandered through a crowded market, Mai got separated from her mother. Despite Mrs. Tam's frantic search, she never saw her daughter again. For years, Mrs. Tam had no news of Mai. The memory of her daughter's disappearance still haunted her. Every time she thought of her, guilt would choke her, filling her heart with sorrow. This haunting sense of loss was the reason Mrs. Tam had resigned herself to a life of solitude. She sold bananas in the market, doing her best to live with honesty and preserve the dignity she had left. It was a lonely life, but it was the only one she knew how to live. That morning, as usual, Mrs. Tam sat watching the world pass by. The market was relatively quiet, as it often was at this hour, with a few early risers picking up their goods. But today, the market seemed more vibrant than usual. A young woman stood out among the crowd, her presence like a ray of light in the dull surroundings. This was Lynn, a young businesswoman who had just arrived from the city for work. She had come to the market to buy some simple, rustic items as gifts. Lynn's elegant appearance immediately set her apart from the others. She wore a crisp, pure white shirt paired with dress pants, a sharp contrast to the dusty, crowded atmosphere of the market. As she made her way through the stalls, her eyes scanned the various items on display, pausing occasionally to inspect the wares of the rattan sellers. When she passed by Mrs. Tam's stall, something made her stop. The yellow, ripe bananas caught her attention, perhaps because of the stark contrast between the humble stall and her own polished appearance. Lynn's soft voice broke the silence. "Grandma, how much are these bananas?" she asked, her tone gentle yet distant. Mrs. Tam looked up in surprise, momentarily taken aback by the elegant young woman standing before her. With a warm smile, Mrs. Tam replied, "Dear girl, these bananas are 20 ngàn for a bunch. They're very ripe and sweet." Lynn nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "Please help me weigh out 3 bunches," she said. Mrs. Tam, careful and attentive, selected the ripest, most beautiful bunches of bananas, their golden brown hue glistening in the sunlight. She placed them on the scale with gentle hands, then wrapped them carefully in some old newspaper to protect them. Lynn reached into her wallet, pulling out a 500,000 Ngan bill. She handed it to Mrs. Tam, but when the older woman saw the large amount, her face fell slightly. "I'm afraid I don't have change," Mrs. Tam said, her voice tinged with worry. Lynn, however, was calm and untroubled. "It's all right, Grandma," she said with a reassuring smile. "Please keep it. Consider it a little extra." Mrs. Tam shook her head, clearly uncomfortable. "No, no, dear. This is too much. Please, wait a moment," she insisted. She rose slowly, searching for someone who might have small change, but Lynn simply shook her head. "Please, Grandma, don't worry about it," she repeated. "I insist." The old woman, torn between her desire to keep her dignity and her need to accept help, hesitated for a moment, but in the end she relented, grateful for the kindness of the young woman. As Lynn walked away, the sound of her footsteps faded into the background, but Mrs. Tam stood for a moment, gazing at the 500,000 Ngan bill in her hand. It was a small act of kindness, yet it left her with a feeling of warmth and hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. The sun, now higher in the sky, cast long shadows across the market, but for Mrs. Tam, the day seemed just a little bit brighter. The memory of the kind young woman and the warmth of the simple exchange lingered in her heart as she returned to her spot in the shade, ready to face another day with a renewed sense of dignity and grace. Mrs. Tam placed the bunch of bananas down carefully, her hands quick as she hurried to the next row to exchange some money. As she did, Lynn stood waiting nearby. Suddenly, she turned her back to glance around the bustling market, but when Mrs. Tam turned back to the stall, Lynn was already gone. Mrs. Tam stood there, confused, her eyes scanning the market in search of the young girl. Yet, Lynn had already vanished into the crowd, leaving Mrs. Tam standing alone, still uncertain of what had just happened. It wasn't until Mrs. Tam returned to her stall that she noticed something glimmering on the ground where Lynn had been standing. It was a small but sparkling diamond ring. Mrs. Tam bent down to pick it up and studied it carefully, marveling at the exquisite craftsmanship. The ring was clearly no ordinary piece of jewelry. It was far too beautiful and expensive to belong to just anyone. She immediately realized that this ring must have belonged to Lynn. Mrs. Tam's heart raced. Holding the ring, she felt a mix of emotions: confusion, worry, and hesitation. She had no idea how much it was worth, but for someone like her, a poor vendor selling bananas for a living, the value of the ring seemed enormous. With the money she made from selling bananas, she could barely afford to eat every day. Some days, she went hungry just to stretch the little money she had. A ring like this could change her life, perhaps even allow her to repair the dilapidated house she lived in. But deep down, Mrs. Tam knew that honesty had always been her guiding principle. She sighed softly and tucked the ring into her pocket. "What belongs to someone else must be returned," she muttered under her breath. She decided to wait for Lynn to come back so she could return the ring. Mrs. Tam sat down and watched the people go by, hoping Lynn would return soon to claim what was rightfully hers. But as the minutes passed, and then the hours, the young girl did not appear. Mrs. Tam's concern grew. The vendor next to her, noticing her unease, asked, "Where is that girl?" "The one who was here earlier?" Mrs. Tam's eyes were filled with worry, and she couldn't hide it as she shared the story with her fellow vendor. However, she didn't mention that she was holding the ring. She was afraid that if word got out, someone might try to steal it. Yet, despite the growing uncertainty, Mrs. Tam was determined to wait. She believed that kindness would ultimately lead to a good resolution. She just had to wait for Lynn to come back, but the hours dragged on. Mrs. Tam continued to sit in her corner, never taking her eyes off the street where Lynn had passed earlier. The heat of the day was fading, and the sun began to lower, casting a pale yellow light across the market. The air had a faint, sweet scent of ripe bananas, but all Mrs. Tam could focus on was the hope that Lynn would return for the ring. Even though Mrs. Tam was tired, she didn't dare leave her seat. What if Lynn came back looking for the ring and couldn't find her? The thought filled her with dread. She couldn't let that happen. Vendors around her had started packing up their stalls, preparing to leave for the day. Yet Mrs. Tam remained, patiently waiting, holding on to the hope that the young girl would return. Why was she so determined to stay? Mrs. Tam couldn't quite understand it herself. The small diamond ring weighed heavily in her pocket, like a burden. Many times throughout the day, doubts crept into her mind. What if Lynn never came back? What if this ring was meant to be hers after all? But every time Mrs. Tam pushed those thoughts aside. The ring didn't belong to her. It wasn't hers to keep. Her conscience was clear. She would wait. As the late afternoon sun began to fade and the cool breeze of the evening stirred the air, Mrs. Tam remained by her stall, her eyes fixed on the road. Just as she was about to stand up and leave, a familiar voice called out behind her, "Ma'am, have you seen the ring?" Mrs. Tam turned quickly. She immediately recognized the young girl who had bought bananas from her that morning. Lynn's face was no longer calm. Her expression was filled with clear anxiety, and her eyes were red, as if she had been searching all day. It was clear that Lynn had been desperately looking for the ring. Mrs. Tam felt a wave of relief wash over her as she stood up, ready to return what had been lost. The small action of waiting, of showing kindness and honesty, had led to this moment, a moment when Mrs. Tam knew, deep in her heart, that the right thing had been done. The girl stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She breathed a sigh of relief as she finally arrived. There was something important she needed to give. With trembling hands, she slowly pulled a ring from her pocket. The light from the diamonds sparkled brilliantly under the soft glow. The left side of the diamond caught the light just right, making her eyes twinkle in amazement. Lynn's eyes lit up as she stepped forward, eager to receive the precious ring from her grandmother's hand. Her voice wavered, filled with emotion. "Grandma, it's true. Thank you so much. This is my mother's keepsake. I thought I'd never find it again." Mrs. Tam looked at the girl with gentle eyes, narrowing them slightly. She could see that the ring was important to her. "Keep it safe," she said softly, her voice warm with care. Lynn stood still for a moment, overwhelmed by the gesture. Yet something else was on her mind. She couldn't help but ask, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Grandma, you don't have much, so why not sell the ring? It could help you take care of yourself." Mrs. Tam simply smiled. Her smile was simple but full of warmth. She replied, "I may not have much, child, but if I were to take something that didn't belong to me, whether I had a lot of money or not, I would never have peace of mind. True peace isn't bought. It's found in doing what's right." Lynn was silent, absorbing the truth in Mrs. Tam's words. They struck a deep chord within her. She had grown up surrounded by the rush and calculations of city life, where people often did whatever it took to survive, no matter the cost. But here, in this simple woman's eyes, Lynn saw something else entirely, something she had never truly understood. Mrs. Tam's life was humble, yet full of an integrity and strength Lynn had never experienced. Suddenly, Lynn felt an overwhelming urge to understand more. "Grandma," she asked with a deep sense of concern, "you live alone. Where is your family?" Mrs. Tam let out a sigh, her eyes clouding over with a hint of sadness. "I had a daughter," she said quietly, "but she passed away when she was young. Since then, I've been on my own, doing what I can to survive. I've learned to live with little, and I'm okay with that." Lynn's heart broke as she listened to Mrs. Tam's story. She couldn't imagine how much pain the old woman had endured. Lynn reflected on her own life, full of privileges, yet lacking the simple, profound values that Mrs. Tam held: honesty, perseverance, and kindness. "Grandma," Lynn said softly, her voice filled with emotion, "let me show you where you live. I want to visit you later." At first, Mrs. Tam refused with a gentle smile, saying, "I'm just a simple banana seller. There's no need for you to bother with me." But Lynn's determination was unwavering. She insisted, refusing to take no for an answer. "I need to know where you live, Grandma," she said, her eyes pleading. "Please let me help in any way I can." In the end, Mrs. Tam relented. She slowly stood up and began walking with Lynn through the narrow, winding alleys of the city. The small, dilapidated houses seemed to crowd together, their roofs bent and weathered by time, as though they were desperately trying to support each other against the relentless forces of life. They stopped in front of a tiny crook. After making sure Mrs. Tam had everything she needed and that she could rest, Lynn left with a new sense of resolve. She immediately contacted her close friend Hui, an investigative reporter, and shared the story of Mrs. Tam with him. Hui, ever the resourceful one, agreed to help. He promised to dig into the information he could find about the girl named Mai, using his connections and access to databases to uncover any clues. Lynn also asked Hui to look into Mrs. Tam's past and family history, hoping to piece together the fragments of a story that had been broken for so long. Just a few days later, Hui called Lynn, his voice filled with excitement. "Lynn, I think I've found something. I believe I've located Mrs. Tam's daughter, and this woman is incredible. Do you have time? I need to tell you more." Lynn quickly agreed to meet him at a cafe, her heart racing with anticipation. When they met, Hui handed her a file, which contained a photograph of a middle-aged woman standing confidently at a press conference. She was impeccably dressed, radiating both elegance and authority. Lynn stared at the photo, and a wave of disbelief swept over her. Could this be Mrs. Tam's daughter? "This is Mai," Hui said, his voice filled with awe. "Her full name is Nguyen Thi Mai. She's currently the CEO of a major real estate corporation. And Lynn, she's a billionaire." Lynn's mouth dropped open in shock. The woman in the photo looked nothing like the daughter she had imagined for Mrs. Tam. How could this be? How could Mrs. Tam have lived in poverty for decades while her daughter was living such a life of wealth and influence? Hui continued, explaining further. "It's quite a long story. From what I've gathered, Mai lost her mother at a young age. She was adopted by a wealthy family, and although she lived a life of privilege, she never stopped searching for her biological mother. Despite her efforts to find Mrs. Tam, there was almost no information available. All her attempts were in vain." Lynn sat in stunned silence, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She didn't know how to feel, whether to rejoice that Mrs. Tam's daughter was alive and successful, or to mourn the years they had lost. But one thing was clear: despite their circumstances, both Mrs. Tam and Mai deserved to meet again. Lynn knew that finding Mrs. Tam's daughter was only the first step. Now, more than ever, she felt determined to bring them back together, no matter the distance or the years that had passed. They both deserved a reunion, a chance to heal the wounds of the past. In her heart, Lynn understood that some bonds are unbreakable, even by time and circumstance, and so she set out on a new mission: to reunite a mother with her long-lost daughter, no matter the cost. But how could they arrange this long-awaited meeting without overwhelming both of them with too many emotions? After thinking it over for a while and carefully considering the situation, Lynn decided to contact Mai directly. She sent an email to her, telling the story of Mrs. Tam and attaching a photo of the two of them together, one from Mai's childhood found in Mrs. Tam's house. Within just a few hours, Mai replied with heartfelt and deeply emotional words. Lynn could feel the woman's heart beating through her reply. and it was clear that the bond between them had already begun to form. Mai agreed to meet Mrs. Tam immediately. Together, they carefully planned the reunion, a long-awaited moment that was now within reach. Finally, the day arrived. Lynn drove Mrs. Tam to a large villa located on the outskirts of the city, where Mai had been waiting for them. Along the way, Mrs. Tam kept asking Lynn what was going on, but Lynn simply smiled, offering reassurance. "You'll understand soon," she said. When they finally arrived at the villa and the car came to a stop, Mrs. Tam was utterly surprised. Standing before her was an enormous gate that opened, revealing Mai. She stepped out with an elegant grace, though her eyes were red from the tears she had been holding back. The moment she saw Mrs. Tam, she couldn't hold herself back any longer. She ran toward her, arms wide, and threw herself into a hug, crying out, "Mom, I've finally found you." Mrs. Tam stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe her eyes. She trembled, raising a shaky hand to gently touch Mai's face, as if trying to convince herself that this was real, that it wasn't just a dream. "Is that really you?" she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Mai, tears streaming down her face, nodded, her voice filled with love and pain. "Yes, it's me, Mom. I've been looking for you for so many years." The two women embraced each other, their tears blending together in an emotional reunion, as if trying to make up for all the lost time. Lynn stood silently at the side, watching the scene unfold. Her heart was filled with warmth, and she couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the moment. She hadn't expected that a small act like returning a ring would lead to such a miraculous and life-changing reunion. The journey of Mrs. Tam and Mai, of mother and daughter finding each other again, was not only a story of love, it was also a testament to the power of kindness, perseverance, and the belief that, no matter how long the road may be, love always finds a way. Mai made the decision to bring Mrs. Tam to live with her, promising to take care of her and to make up for all the years they had been apart. The happiness of finally being reunited with her daughter filled Mrs. Tam's heart, and she knew that she had found the one thing that could make her life complete. This reunion didn't just change Mrs. Tam's life, it transformed her spirit. She realized that sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness to turn everything around, to change someone's fate forever. The spirit of love, compassion, and kindness had worked a miracle in her life, one that she had never dared to imagine. Since the day she was reunited with her daughter, Mrs. Tam's life had taken a turn that she never thought possible. Gone were the days of sitting in the street corner, selling bananas just to make ends meet. She no longer had to worry about her next meal or the cold rain falling on the roof above her head. Now, Mrs. Tam lived in the comfort and luxury of a large villa, where everything she could ever need was at her fingertips. The first day she entered the villa, she couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. The space was elegant, and the walls were adorned with beautiful paintings. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, adding to the air of sophistication. It was a life she had never dreamed of, a life of comfort and security. But despite all the material wealth, it wasn't the luxury that moved her most. It was the love and care that Mai showed her, the way her daughter treated her with such tenderness, as if to make up for all the years they had lost. Mai spent the whole morning giving her a tour of the house, showing her every corner with excitement, as if she were a child sharing her favorite toys. "Mom, I've prepared this room especially for you," she said with a smile. The room was spacious, with a large, soft bed and windows that opened up to a breathtaking garden filled with colorful flowers. On the table was an old photograph of Mai and Mrs. Tam as children, framed neatly in glass. It was a reminder that despite the passage of time, motherly love never fades. As Mrs. Tam stood in the room, tears began to roll down her cheeks. She could hardly believe her eyes. Never had she imagined that one day she would live in such a beautiful place. More than that, she could hardly believe that the child she had spent so many years searching for had grown up to become such a successful and caring woman. I don't even know what to say," she whispered, overwhelmed by emotions. This was a moment Mrs. Tam would treasure for the rest of her life. It was more than just a reunion. It was a chance to start over, to heal the wounds of the past, and to embrace a future filled with love, security, and the warmth of family. She now understood that miracles do happen, and that even in the darkest moments there is always hope. In the end, this story wasn't just about the reunion of a mother and daughter. It was a powerful reminder of the strength of love and kindness. Even in a world that often seems cold and indifferent, it is these simple acts of goodness that have the power to change lives in ways we could never expect. A heartwarming reunion, a mother and daughter's journey. How do you arrange a meeting that could stir emotions too deep to contain after years of separation? After careful thought and deliberation, Lynn decided to reach out directly to Mai. She sent an email sharing the story of Mrs. Tam, accompanied by a heartfelt message and photos, one of herself and another of Mai as a child, a photo Lynn had found at Mrs. Tam's house. The response came just a few hours later. Mai's words were so moving, Lynn could almost feel her heartbeat through the screen. Mai agreed to meet her birth mother right away, and together they began planning this emotional reunion. On the day of the long-awaited meeting, Lynn drove Mrs. Tam to a large villa in the suburbs. Along the way, Mrs. Tam couldn't stop asking Lynn what was going on, but Lynn simply smiled and reassured her, "You'll understand soon." When they arrived, the car stopped in front of the grand house. Mrs. Tam stared in disbelief at the beautiful mansion before her. Then the large front doors opened. Stepping out gracefully was Mai, her appearance refined and elegant, but her eyes red and brimming with emotion. She saw Mrs. Tam, and it was as if time itself stopped. Without hesitation, Mai ran toward Mrs. Tam and threw her arms around her, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I finally found you."
Mrs. Tam stood frozen, unable to believe her eyes. Trembling, she